Okay, welcome everyone to this introductory talk of our today's KC Live event. And as Annie already said, my topic is modern IGA capabilities and zero trust identity. So it's more focused on the IGA part of IAM, but I'll take an overall a little bit broader perspective on how identity management, IGA, and zero trust are linked together. And so at the end, why identity is so essential to zero trust. And let's start. I think most of you have heard definitions of zero trust already and discussed this term. And so I'd like to look a little more on how zero trust has evolved from where it started to where it is today and will be in the future. And at the end, zero trust, the main principle behind it is don't trust, but always verify, or maybe a little bit more in detail, don't trust blindly. So don't trust a single component and then assume everyone is good because someone who passed your remote access, your firewall, or another component, well, that should be all good, and then that person can do whatever the person wants to do in your network. No, avoid this lateral movement and don't just rely on a single entity. So verify regularly and at multiple places. This is, I think, where this entire theme starts. And when we look at how zero trust evolved over the past couple of years, at the beginning, zero trust was a term which usually was pronounced zero trust networks. It became very, very quickly apparent that this is too narrow. Yes, you must not just trust the firewall, but by the way, yes, even in zero trust concepts, firewalls play a very vital role. You need them. You need a lot of components for security. Firewalls are one of the elements. It was about avoiding the lateral movement, about also going into microsegmentation into smaller chunks of your network. From there, it was a broader security perspective. So beyond just the network security part, towards system security, device security, and verification at more levels than initially in this zero trust concept. And the next step of evolution then was identity. And probably a lot of you have heard this term, this notion of identity is the new perimeter. I think we can argue about that. I believe that there are many parameters, that identity is a parameter, that devices are parameters, that microsegments in your network are parameters, and that the art of zero trust is to create well thought out parameters and protect these parameters and verify at various places. So identity and access are essential, and I'll talk about it why in a minute. They are a really super important element. Managing the identities, managing the access, adaptive authentication, so working with in a risk and context-based model, very important. But I also see that we go beyond that already. So I think one of the major learnings of the SolarWinds incident last year and the subsequent attacks we have seen on the software supply chain over the past couple of months is we also must not blindly trust software that we procure, be it commercial off-the-shelf software, be it cloud services, be it software that is in things, maybe things we use as a manufacturer to create new things. We must not blindly trust that software. We need to understand what is in that software. Is it at risk? We need to check it. We need to verify. And so we need to extend zero trust into everything. As an essential paradigm, the paradigm will not change. It's really this don't trust, verify at many places. It's a foundation for the cybersecurity supply chain risk management. It's a foundation for good cybersecurity across your entire organization. And we need to take a as broad as we can perspective for all which might be in the scope of attackers, and everything which is connected is in the scope of the attackers. Having said this, let's have a look at where identity comes into play beyond what I already touched. Identity, at the end of the day, is where zero trust starts. It is where you can get a good grip in some way at the beginning, identity, and at the end, access of what is happening with the critical assets you want to protect, your data, your applications, your systems. And when we look at this picture, then it's honestly a simplified perspective on what happens during access. We have, let's take human access. We could do this as well with system to system, etc. But let's take just human interactive access. Someone, the user, with a device, comes through networks, usually a series of networks, the Wi-Fi at home, some public internet connection, your corporate network, or whatever else, the network of your SaaS provider, to a system and an application. You may have control about a system or not. If it's a SaaS service, you only see the app, the running service, so to speak, and then something happens with data. So this is what happens. And the question is, where along this chain can we gain control? Where do we get a grip on what is happening? And when we look at the user, then it starts as a user. The user authenticates. The user has an identity. We can do identity vetting. We need to create accounts for the user. This is where IAM in a broader sense, but also IGA for creating the accounts, for the life cycles around the user come into play. So that's where we have a good level of control. And that is where we need to, where identity where it becomes clear that identity is a super, super essential thing within every zero trust concept. Without that, you're losing one of your major points of control. Then we have the device where it gets a little bit more complicated because, yes, it might be a corporate-owned device with good endpoint management and you have a lot of control, or not. It might be a bring your own device. And so you're somewhat more limited here. When it comes to the network, you can build things. You can create your SD-WAN environments. You can create your network segments and stuff like that. But if someone is traveling, if someone is using his Wi-Fi at home, etc., then it's frequently hard to get full control about the network. This is overall probably the hardest area to really implement well-working security. It needs a lot of touch points. It's not easy. There are things you can do. There are limitations. And there might be also limitations. Take standard VPN access, which then just mean, okay, you can secure things, but at the cost of performance and convenience. Next level, the system or application. That's where access control come into play, where authorization, so who can do what in this application, where your roles or other types of entitlements become relevant. So again, a very good control. And again, it's about identity and access management, about IGA as that part which helps you managing entitlements, and IGA as the part which helps you also keeping the governance of who does what, who can do what. And last but not least, it's data. We need to think about data governance. We need to think about how can we better control what happens not only with systems. So Martin is allowed to do that. He has that role in that system, but also which files is Martin accessing? Are these files encrypted? Where are they ending up? What happens in your analytics space? So data is the other field we need to look at. That's sort of the next level, where we also, again, talk about IGA, about data governance, about other forms of access governance, but it's very close to what we look at within the IAM field. But again, it starts with the identity. This is where we really can gain control about what is happening in our world. And so this is an essential element of every zero trust strategy. When we then look at zero trust a little bit more in detail, it's also important And I think the previous slide already has demonstrated it in some way. There were many elements, and it's not that there's a single place where we can control security, where we can sort of implement the verifications, the proofs we need in our complex environments where IT happens today. We had the last 15 months with a lot of work from home, with a speeding up, even more speeding up shift to SaaS services, with the introduction of many new tools, for instance, for collaboration in many organizations. So there are more components in, and it's not that there's a single thing you can do to implement a zero trust model effectively. So, and you always need to understand it's not about tools, it's about a concept, a paradigm, an architecture where you then can create your own zero trust sort of architecture, environment, strategy. So you need to understand what is all in that picture. You need to understand how this thing should work together, where your gaps are, and what are the priorities to increase your security posture to get more secure than you have been before. This is a high-level depiction of zero trust architecture components. As you see, there's a network, and there are many elements of network security, such as threat intelligence, such as SIEM, and many others. There's endpoint, the device we already talked about, and there's identity access management. And over time, you also might add more things around software security, for instance, to reach an even higher level within your zero trust architecture. But IAM in that is one of the central elements. And when we look at identity management, to go a little bit more in detail, then there are topics like identity vetting. So how do you really verify that Martin really is Martin? I think in my case, it's relatively simple because either there are hundreds of videos out there and hundreds of pictures of me talking about identity, and it's always someone else, or it's always Martin. So in my case, it might be a little bit simpler than for some others. But that's where it starts. It's about authentication, it's about the user attribute data, it's about tracking user behavior, but it's also about IGA. IGA is very essential because it's managing the identities, managing the accounts, managing the access, and governing the access we need to do. And we need to go beyond today's approach of access governance. We need to add the data governance angle. We also need to think about new concepts, new paradigms. So we see a lot of talk, a lot of discussion about things like just-in-time provisioning, and even more important, just-in-time deprovisioning. So Martin accesses system A or B or C. The entitlements are granted during that access, and they are revoked when the session ends. And we also talk more about policy-based access control. So how can we add runtime control based on policies? What is Martin allowed to do or not? And if the policy changes, there's no need to deprovision static entitlements. So there's a lot of innovation there. There's also a lot of AI-based capabilities coming into play here, capabilities that help in understanding where are anomalies, where are uncommon, unusual combinations of entitlements that might indicate a specific level of risk. Where are the users that have many granular, directly assigned entitlements instead of being managed through roles or groups? All these things come into play. And so identity management in general and IGA in specific are essential elements of every zero trust strategy. Okay, let's go one step further, and that step is really about information, and information also, again, protecting information, or even better, enabling collaboration, but in a secure manner, is even more important. And we at KuppingerCole have created a while ago a concept we call the IPLC, the Information Protection Lifecycle. And this is something which adds to the zero trust concept to this model, because it's about how do you then control this entire life cycle of access to information, to your critical data, to the crown jewels of many organizations, be it financial data, be it intellectual properties, or other highly important data. And this is not the network, but this is the sort of, if you go back to the picture I've shown previously, so to speak, the right-hand side picture of that, which was about the data, so the identity, the device, the network, the system and application, and the data. That's, again, another area. So where we need to understand what we have, but then we need to control access. Again, we need identities and their entitlements to protect that information, to understand what happens there. And then we need to implement that control to the various proof points we need in a zero trust concept to secure that data, to really protect, so to speak, at the end, the crown jewels of many, many organizations today. And for many organizations, it's really the information which counts most. So we need to also understand what to do there. And that also means there are many elements in that, in protecting really what we need to protect. It's not just a firewall or not just an IAM system. It are many elements, but IAM and IGA are at the very core of many, maybe most of the things we are doing when it comes to zero trust. So how do you come to a zero trust approach? How can you end up there? The first thing is, I think you should understand, really make up your own definition of what does zero trust mean for you. How does it relate to SASE? How does it relate to an IPLC, an information protection lifecycle? And then you need to look at the role of the different elements, identity and access, network security, endpoint security, and so on. And then it's about the architecture. So first create a blueprint before you start building the house, like in real life. The likelihood that your house will not fall apart is way higher if you have a good blueprint. And it's more than zero trust networks, and it's where you start identifying your gaps, prioritizing your investments, starting your journey. There are methodologies which really help you in guiding, help you in doing this process, can guide you through that journey. How do you identify the priorities? How do you measure the gaps? How do you come up with a roadmap? So, and there are quick starts. A quick start is adaptive authentication, because at the end, you always will need multi-factor, risk and context-based authentication. That is definitely not a mistake to do. And a good IGA, definitely also something you need. You need well-defined processes, more than just join or move a lever. You need these processes to be well-defined and well implemented. Don't forget to define them first before you implement them. So the questions you should ask yourself is, do you have your definition and vision already in place? Do you know your gaps? And do you have a plan and a roadmap? If you have that, you're in a good way towards improving your overall security, cybersecurity resilience. Thank you for listening to me.